You know the voice we're taught to trust, the one that writes the report and steadies the room. But what happens when that voice steps over a threshold it was never meant to cross? When training in weapons, scene craft, and narrative control moves from the street to the bedroom, the kitchen, the front door. 4 scenes, 1 bed in Georgia presented as a suicide until physics spoke. 1 road between Pennsylvania and Maryland, where a former officer turned a car into a moving hostage room and a colleague became an accomplice. 1 Massachusetts kitchen, where a detective's service weapon and a digital diary told different stories, and 1 forced entry, a door frame that recorded every blow, a former officer who brought his training home and used it to end a life. What links them isn't just a badge, it's the psychology of control. Who decides what happened? Who gets believed first? Who understands how to place a weapon, how to speak into a 911 line, how to anticipate what investigators expect to see? It's the subtle advantage of insider knowledge and the institutional hesitation that can give a suspect a head start. So ask yourself, when the investigator becomes the suspect, who guards the evidence from the power of the narrative? Should a service weapon ever live in a house marked by fear? Should Amber Alerts trigger faster when the abductor is trained to defeat the playbook? If specialized training helps stage a scene or manipulate first responders, should that be an aggravating factor at sentencing? In this investigation, we will follow the detectives that never blink, the geometry of a bullet's path, the language of bloodstains, the diary our devices write without permission, and the signatures a doorframe leaves behind. This is not a referendum on every officer. It is a reckoning with what happens when authority turns inward and how our systems must respond before the physics have to. Domestic violence is not primarily about bruises. It's about who gets to be right. It starts with small negotiations that are never really negotiations at all. Who holds the car keys? Which friends are acceptable? Which memories are allowed to stand unchallenged? In policing, we call it command presence. In a home, misused, it becomes a slow rearrangement of reality that the other person has to live inside. Most officers keep that presence where it belongs, on the street, in response to danger. But when it crosses the threshold, the danger becomes intimate and constant, and often invisible to outsiders. Keep that frame in mind as we step into each room.
You know the sound of authority when you hear it. A calm voice on a radio, a uniform that steadies a crowd. We trust that voice to describe what happened, to call the facts as they are. But what happens when that same voice stands inside a bedroom and says, "It was a suicide," while the room whispers a different story? This is the case of Michael Seth Perrault in Eatonton, Georgia, and his wife, Amanda. She died in their home on February 3, 2020. He said she pulled the trigger. Forensic evidence, a documented history of domestic violence, and a jury's verdict said he did. This is not a story about a single gunshot. It's a story about control, how it's built, how it's disguised, and how training meant to protect a community can be turned inward against one person behind a door that was supposed to be safe. In the days leading up to Amanda's death, red flags gathered like storm clouds. A prior domestic incident, visible injuries, steps toward protective measures. Statistically, the most dangerous window in a coercive relationship is the one just before independence, the filing of a protective order, the quiet plan to leave, the decision to speak. Control, threatened, seeks a firmer grip. On February 3rd, Perrault told authorities that Amanda shot herself in their bed. The scene could be read as a tragic suicide, a bedroom, a handgun, a grieving spouse with a practiced understanding of how suicides are initially evaluated. But a bedroom is also a witness. Gravity tells the truth. Fabric remembers pressure. Microscopic droplets draw maps. Investigators from the Putnam County Sheriff's Office and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation began their work, and the room began to talk. Bloodstain patterns map proximity with a grammar no story can edit. In a self-inflicted gunshot to the head, analysts expect certain distributions on the victim's hands and forearms, and a particular range of fine mist on nearby bedding. They also expect distance effects elsewhere, the absence of high-velocity spatter where no body could have stood. Investigators reported spatter evidence inconsistent with a self-inflicted shot and consistent with an assailant close to the victim at the moment of discharge. Tiny droplets placed a person where his words insisted he wasn't. The weapon told its own story. A gun that is dropped leaves impressions, lint transfer, microfibers, pressure marks where metal meets cloth. A gun that is placed often does not. The bedding becomes a slope of uncooperative truth to anyone crafting a scene after the fact. Add to that the language of contact and near-contact wounds, soot deposition, stippling, fabric imprinting. The bullet's path through bone and soft tissue is geometry. The entry, the angle, the exit or lodging point, all of it must reconcile with a self-inflicted shot by a right-handed person lying as described. If it doesn't, the room outranks the voice. There were small details that pressed their advantage. Semi-automatic pistols eject cases in predictable arcs, influenced by grip, angle, and obstacles like pillows and headboards. Where a casing lands can either support or contradict a claimed orientation. When casing logic fails, the story bends with it. For experienced investigators, casings are not debris, they are punctuation marks. First responders also attend to the sound of the story. A genuine shock call often has the messy rhythm of action interrupting speech, CPR compressions between words, questions to dispatch cut short by attempts at aid. Calls from staged scenes can invert that. Narration over action, a steady pace, an intact composure. No ethical investigator hangs a case on tone, but they use it as a compass for what to test and where the truth is likely to resist the easiest explanation. Investigating an officer is a cultural test as much as a forensic one. You're in hallways where people wore the same patch as the suspect, traded shifts, covered each other's calls. Familiarity can soften questions, the quiet edge of the blue wall. Putnam County's leadership took a posture that mattered. Outside forensic support where necessary, public commitment to method over membership, and a simple promise: the facts, not the uniform, will decide. In the autopsy suite, a forensic pathologist read the body's version, lividity patterns, wound characteristics, stippling and soot where they should be, or shouldn't. Medical findings and scene analysis converged on homicide. That convergence, spatter patterns, trajectory, residue distribution, weapon placement, and the history of domestic abuse undercut the suicide narrative that arrived so ready-made. When the picture focused, Perrault was arrested and charged. In court, jurors were asked to choose between two versions of a bedroom. One version said despair, the other said control adorned as tragedy. The jury chose the room's version and convicted him of murder. He received a life sentence. Appeals are processes. They don't rewrite physics. Why do abusers so often adopt the suicide cover? Because intimacy is a shield. A bed is a quiet place, a plausible backdrop for despair, a space where outsiders feel they should avert their eyes. And when the person narrating that scene is trained in calm delivery and scene description, the illusion can be hard to break. The counterweight is stubborn physics of blood and gravity, and the insistence that evidence, not allegiance, sets the outcome. The toolbox misused here wasn't just a firearm. It was a demeanor that convinces skeptical colleagues, an insider's knowledge of suicide protocols, relationships with the very people who will collect the first statements. When misapplied, those tools become levers: place the weapon, control the 911 narrative, frame depression as context, count on deference. In Amanda's case, those levers met a team willing to test every claim. That is how it should be, even when it hurts a department to do it. Pause and consider the policy surface this case exposes. Should off-duty storage of service weapons in homes with active domestic conflict be allowed without stringent safeguards, audited locks, temporary removal to the department, or court-enforced surrender during investigations? When an officer is named in a domestic report, should there be an automatic protocol, immediate weapon surrender, paid leave, and an outside lethality assessment that considers separation, prior threats, and access to firearms? And should investigations of domestic deaths involving law enforcement default to external agencies and labs to safeguard both truth and community confidence? Interlude: the blue wall, quietly defined. It isn't always a conspiracy. Most often, it's a pause where a hard question should be, a softened tone where a sharp edge is needed, a reluctance to believe that someone like you could do something like this. The cure is policy that replaces personality with process, automatic handoff to outside investigators, external labs for firearms and residue, bans on employing agency staff touching primary evidence, and transparent briefings about method rather than outcome. It protects the case and the legitimacy of those who police the public.
From a quiet bedroom in Georgia, we move onto a road that never should have become a room. The case of Robert Vicosa is not a whodunit. It is a slow-motion catastrophe across county lines, state borders, and a public timeline where every hour mattered and every decision carried a cost. Robert Bobby Vicosa once wore a badge in Baltimore County, Maryland. By November 2021, he was out of the department and estranged from his wife in York County, Pennsylvania. What followed began the way many domestic tragedies do. Control was threatened. Retaliation was swift. According to investigators, he assaulted his estranged wife, restrained her, and fled with their 2 young daughters. Quickly, another uniform entered the picture. Baltimore County Sergeant Tia Bynum, a former colleague and friend. Over days, they moved between Pennsylvania and Maryland. They switched vehicles. They changed locations. They stayed just ahead of a tightening net. And they did it with children in the back seat. Here, training misused became a force multiplier. They understood how surveillance is deployed and where license plate readers watch. They understood Amber Alerts, what triggers them, how quickly the public can be enlisted. They understood negotiators' scripts and the tactical restraint that is obligatory when minors are present. That knowledge bought them time. The first 24 hours were a ledger of hard choices. Amber Alerts are not push-button. They require a confirmed abduction, imminent danger, and actionable detail. Pennsylvania and Maryland agencies weighed a grim calculus: flood the public with an alert and risk spiking a desperate man's panic, or move quietly with targeted tactics, belos, aircraft, license plate readers, federal partners, to try for a controlled stop. The timing of alerts and the debate around them became a wound that would be reopened by hindsight after the final scene. Days ticked by in a jagged line, a sighting here, an armed carjacking in suburban Maryland linked to the pair, a motel room paid in cash, a security camera catching a silhouette for a few frames, social media steeped in fear. Each incident increased urgency, and yet the presence of children constrained tactics. Sudden moves could end in tragedy, so the net tightened with the caution that duty demands around minors. Inside the car, isolation had wheels. The vehicle was a moving room where Vicosa could keep his daughters close, law enforcement at a controlled distance, and every negotiation on his terms. He controlled time by staying in motion, space by choosing where to stop, places where a crossfire would be unthinkable, and narrative by leveraging his past as an officer, counting on the restraint of those pursuing him. The end came on a Maryland roadside in Washington County. Unmarked vehicles, a controlled stop attempt, positioning designed to preserve life. Then, inside the car, shots. When the glass settled, 4 people were dead. Robert Vicosa, Sergeant Tia Bynum, and the 2 children. Investigators said no officers fired their weapons. The deaths were described as a murder-suicide. There would be no courtroom, no cross-examination, no verdict, only autopsies, reports, and the heavy quiet of a scene where every careful choice had been weaponized by a suspect who knew the playbook. Why did it unfold this way? Because control didn't stop at the front door. It migrated to the road. Vicosa held 2 levers, a history of police training and proximity to his children. With those, he shaped not only his estranged wife's terror, but the posture of every agency tasked with stopping him. He knew perimeters. He knew a negotiator's first move. He knew license plate readers' rhythms. He knew the value of switching vehicles and the risk of traceable calls. And with children in the car, he knew the tactical playbook would do everything possible to go slow. The blue wall took a different shape here, not a cover-up, a complicated, human breach, a current sergeant as an accomplice. Tia Bynum's presence reshaped the questions. What does loyalty look like when someone you know spirals? When does empathy become enablement? How could a sworn officer spend those days not as a de-escalator, but as a participant? Departments conducted post-mortems. The public conversation moved beyond pursuit tactics to culture. How do you keep colleagues from crossing a line under the banner of helping a friend? Forensics in the final scene were brief but decisive. Wounds and weapon positions inside the car indicated the killings occurred within the vehicle in the moments surrounding the stop. The rest of the case was built on movement, phones and towers, routers and cameras, the timelines of fuel purchases and cash rooms. The harder work arrived later, re-examining amber criteria for trained suspects, asking whether earlier, sharper interventions at the moment of assault could have changed the arc, debating which of those choices would have risked an even earlier tragedy. Should anything change? Consider this. When a current or former officer is credibly accused of violent domestic assault, firearm surrender should not be discretionary. For current officers, administrative leave with weapon removal must be immediate. For former officers, extreme risk protection orders should be fast-tracked and binding across state lines. The person most at risk, the estranged spouse, should receive real-time notifications when orders are issued, modified, or violated, accompanied by safety planning more robust than a brochure. Amber criteria deserve a trained suspect flag, current or former law enforcement or military, with known access to weapons, triggering faster alerts and different tactics. Cross-jurisdiction incidents need pre-negotiated command structures, an early lead agency, a single incident commander, unified communications, and inside departments, duty to intervene cannot stop at patrol shifts and public altercations. It must apply to off-duty crises among colleagues. Loyalty should include the courage to stop a friend from committing harm, even if that means calling for their arrest. There is an ethical question underneath the operational ones. When the system slows itself to shield children and a suspect leverages that restraint to shape the end, should anything change? Is the morally sustainable answer always to go slow, accept that outcomes may still be tragic, and carry the weight of the what-ifs? Or, in rare cases where a trained suspect demonstrates escalating violence, should tactics shift earlier, even with the risk that escalation brings? These are questions without clean answers, but clarity in policy can at least reduce how often we're left in that impossible space. Families carried grief that cannot be measured. Agencies carried blame they couldn't fully resolve. The public carried arguments over seconds and minutes that will never produce definitive clarity. What we can do is reduce how often we face that choice. The work begins at the front end, when the first assault is reported, when the first protective order is sought, when the first credible threats are made. The question is not whether you can stop a suspect who has decided to end lives inside a car. The question is how many opportunities you take before the keys ever turn.
From a moving car on a Maryland roadside, we step into a quiet Massachusetts kitchen where the story was supposed to end with a tidy explanation. Detective Brian Fanyon of Westfield called 911 and said his wife, Amy, had shot herself with his service weapon during an argument. He said he was in the next room when it happened. It was May 8, 2018. In 2022, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder. The bridge between those years was a contest between a practiced narrative and evidence that doesn't bend, trajectory, residue, and the digital record of a life that was not headed where the story said it was. The first minutes leave room for ambiguity. A married couple, an argument, a service weapon. Responders can see what, at first glance, could be a self-inflicted gunshot. The question is whether the scene belongs to that category or to something else wearing its clothes. Start with physics. Close contact gunshot wounds bear signatures, soot and stippling, sometimes a faint muzzle imprinting on fabric. Trajectory traces a path no narrative can redraw. The bullet's angle must make sense for a self-inflicted shot by a right or left-handed person in the described position. If the path requires contortions inconsistent with furniture, posture, or reach, seams begin to show. Residue is fickle but useful. Transfer can occur from lawful handling. Absence isn't definitive. But patterns are telling. Analysts examine palms, the web between thumb and forefinger, forearms, cuffs. They test nearby surfaces. In self-inflicted shots, they expect particular distributions. Breaches in those expectations don't solve the case, but they chip away at the story. The room's choreography matters. A service pistol placed versus dropped. Bedding that either bears weight memories or sits suspiciously undisturbed. Spent casings resting in positions that either align with ejection angle or argue with it. Semi-automatic pistols eject in arcs. Counterstops and cabinet faces deflect those arcs in predictable ways. Casings are storytellers if you ask them the right questions. From physical to digital, the case crossed a threshold where a detective's professional confidence met its limit. Houses and phones keep diaries. Routers log arrivals and departures. Smartwatches keep step counts. Photos and apps stamp time with indifference to tragedy. Investigators reconstructed a day from devices. Prosecutors later described patterns that cut against the explanation of impulsive, self-inflicted death, search histories about new beginnings, communications with another woman suggesting emotional departure from the marriage, gaps and deletions on devices around key moments. The power of this evidence isn't in a single item, it's in convergence, a marriage under strain, a detective who knew how suicides are worked, what responders look for, what words land. A wife whose recent life, a calendar, messages, plans, didn't mirror sudden secret despair. A service weapon that belonged to him. A room that didn't corroborate. A device ecosystem that wouldn't sign the alibi. There is a reflex to defer to a familiar uniform, to grant the first minutes a halo of credibility. That's the quiet edge of the blue wall. The answer is leadership that doesn't flinch and policy that assumes humanity and fallibility. In Westfield, the case was handled like any other suspected domestic homicide, with the extra caution you need when the suspect understands your process. Tight chains of custody, clear lab work, experts who teach rather than perform. The defense asked jurors to accept tragedy. The prosecution asked them to accept physics and pixels. In November 2022, the jury returned first-degree murder. In Massachusetts, that means life without parole. Appeals followed, as they do. The verdict remained a statement about evidence outlasting shock. Pause and pull the pattern into focus. Control. Control of narrative. What happened, where, why. Control of the first minutes. Who speaks, what's said, what tone is set. Control built in a career that quietly relocated from the street to the home. In cases like this, that control meets the limits of two detectives that don't blink. Geometry and timestamps. Ask yourself, should service weapons live in domestic spaces without strict accountability? Audited storage, automatic removal when there's a domestic investigation, independent oversight when those weapons become instruments of death. When an officer is named in a domestic incident, should protocol be immediate, weapon surrender, administrative leave, and an outside risk assessment before any return to duty? Should domestic deaths involving law enforcement automatically go to outside agencies and labs, without exceptions? There is a moral perimeter here as well. If professional training makes staged deception more plausible, give someone the confidence to tell a story calibrated for investigators, should misuse of that training be an aggravating factor at sentencing, recognized as an abuse of position? When we talk about trust, the badge buying a little grace in the first minutes, do we account for the cost when that grace is misplaced? We owe Amy a different kind of ending. A life has texture, appointments on a calendar, messages making plans, groceries midweek. Prosecutors argued those textures didn't align with sudden private despair. Jurors weighing physics and pixels agreed. Not vindictive, corrective. The room and the data got to tell their versions too. Every modern scene contains several witnesses you can't interview. The router, who arrived, who left, and when. The smartwatch, steps and heart rate patterns that become silent testimony. The car's infotainment system, a map of connections and movement. Doorbell and hallway cameras, silhouettes more honest than stories. Cloud backups, the ghost of deleted messages. The first hour is decisive. Data rolls over. Notifications push older records out of easy reach. Investigators who treat digital ecosystems as central, not supplementary, make fewer mistakes and ask better questions in court.
From a Massachusetts kitchen where a digital diary undid a polished story, we turn to a case that reminds us these dynamics don't recognize borders. The name is Makawene Jeffrey Njana, a former police officer, a marriage that had fractured, a threshold that should have remained closed, and a decision to carry training meant for public safety into a private act of control. Reports indicate that Njana forced his way into his wife's home and used his service weapon to kill her. Coverage states he was sentenced in 2025. The contours are familiar. Separation underway, a home adjusted for safety, the quiet rituals of reclaiming a life, followed by an intrusion that turned a living room or a bedroom into a place where training became a weaponized form of confidence. We will keep minor details anonymized out of respect, but the pattern is the point. When a door is breached in a domestic case, the evidence starts at the frame. Entry speaks in cut wood and fresh metal scars, splintering at the strike plate, paint transfer along the latch, pry tool signatures where leverage met resistance, the blunt impact line where a shoulder hit the panel. Investigators read those signatures to answer a question that will matter in court. Did the victim let him in, or did he force his way through? If a suspect claims invitation or a sudden argument, the door often says otherwise with photographic patience. Inside, physical truth accumulates in stubborn details. Displaced furniture, a lamp toppled onto a rug where the base leaves dust rings, the path of ejected cases arcing around obstacles, stippling and soot on fabric mapping distance, trajectory through drywall tracing a path from muzzle to wall. In trained hands, close-range shot groupings are tight, more so than most civilian shooters. Ironically, precision becomes a signature that can argue against chaos and for intent. Digital devices are no less fluent. A smartwatch counts steps, then records a hard stop when violence interrupts routine. A phone's accelerometer logs a burst of movement, followed by stillness. A home router logs which devices stayed and which left. Hallway cameras capture silhouettes and timestamps in silence. Neighbors hear the sequence in echoes. A door strike, a voice raised, the staccato of shots, then the emptiness that follows. Investigators weave those threads until the initial narrative, whatever it was, can't breathe without contradicting itself. Training magnifies domestic crime in three ways that became evident here. First, familiarity with breaching, knowing where to place force,
how much to use, how to avoid injuring oneself. Second, comfort with weapons, muscle memory in drawing, indexing, firing under stress. Third, composure in chaos, the practiced calm that can sell a story in the fog of the first minutes. The counterweight is process and speed. External investigators, immediate separation and recorded statements, independent lab work, and a digital seizure routine that treats every device as a witness who forgets fast. The courtroom turns on geometry and character. Geometry because angles, residues, distances, and trajectories don't lie under oath. Character because the pattern of control leading up to the killing matters. Escalating threats, prior assaults, protective orders, surveillance of movements, interference with devices and finances. Jurors are asked to see more than a single moment. They are asked to see a campaign, a series of choices culminating at a door and a trigger. When sentencing arrives, the tribunal should say something larger than guilty. It should acknowledge the abuse of trust when a trained officer turns inward. Some laws call it an aggravating factor, abusing a position of trust or misusing specialized skills. Labels aside, the principle stands. Training should raise the guardrails around a community. Using it to climb over someone's boundary is a betrayal that demands recognition in punishment. This case raises policy questions that travel across borders. Why did a former officer still have a service weapon or a comparable firearm during a period of documented domestic volatility? Were there opportunities, protective orders, firearm surrender laws, off-boarding protocols at separation to reduce access? Did anyone assess risk using validated tools that account for separation, threats, weapon access, and training? When those tools flag high lethality risk, are safeguards triggered automatically or left to discretion? From a staged suicide in a Georgia bedroom, to a weaponized road in Maryland and Pennsylvania, to a Massachusetts home where a digital constellation outlasted a lie, to a forced entry that ended in a 2025 sentence. 4 cases, 1 pattern. Training intended for protection became a lever for control. Credibility at the start met its equal in evidence at the end. Blood dynamics, trajectory, device metadata, entry signatures. The question that remains is whether our systems move fast enough at the first sign of danger to keep those proofs from ever having to be assembled.
Experts in coercive control and intimate partner homicide often repeat a hard truth. The most dangerous time is when the person at risk steps toward freedom, filing a protective order, moving out, seeking a counselor, telling friends. The risk spikes because control is a zero-sum resource to an abuser. A partner's autonomy is experienced as a loss. For trained professionals, officers, deputies, military, the spike can be even sharper because the person losing control knows where the system's seams are. The countermeasure is as unromantic as it is essential. Procedures that don't depend on goodwill, immediate weapon surrender, rapid risk assessment, cross-agency alerts, visible accountability. We do not resign ourselves to inevitability. We build guardrails that anticipate the worst and protect the person stepping toward the door. We began with a bed that told the truth more clearly than the person standing beside it. We followed a moving car where insider knowledge boxed in the choices of people trying to save 2 children. We stood in a kitchen where timestamps and trajectories spoke louder than a detective's tone. We closed with a door that answered first the question, how did he get in? Different rooms and roads, the same structure beneath them. Abuse of power as control. Command presence doesn't retire at home. It can become the vocabulary of coercion. Who decides where someone goes, who they see, what version of events gets repeated until it sounds true? Training as accelerant. Knowing how to work a scene, handle a firearm, and narrate an emergency gives a suspect a head start. That head start is countered only by structured skepticism and externalization. Investigations moved outside the suspect's circle of trust, evidence that outlives narrative. Physics and pixels are the detectives that never blink. Blood places people in space. Casings reveal angles. Routers log presence. Watches mark movement, and the moment it stops. Timing as destiny. The step toward freedom, filing a protective order, moving out, asking for help, is the most dangerous window. That's when systems must act without hesitation. Remove weapons, escalate monitoring, surround the at-risk person with attention, and make avoidance impossible for the person losing control. So what must change? Externalize investigations by default when a law enforcement employee, current or former, is a suspect in a domestic death. Outside agency, outside lab, public method. This is not an insult to a department, it is a promise to the public. Neutralize risk early. Immediate, court-enforceable firearm surrender when an officer or former officer is credibly accused of violent domestic conduct. Temporary removal of duty weapons and off-duty carry privileges, with due process and clear paths for review, while risk is assessed by independent specialists. Digitize the first hour. Treat device ecosystems as primary evidence. Warrant quickly. Preserve phones, routers, cameras, car systems, and wearables before logs roll and memories soften. Train detectives to build tech timelines with the same fluency they bring to trajectory diagrams. Humanize the response. Build confidential advocacy channels adjacent to departments so spouses can report fear without routing through the suspect's colleagues. Train supervisors and peers to recognize red flags, sleep deprivation, rage leaks, isolation, financial stress, threats about custody, and to intervene with authority and compassion. Rebuild AMBER criteria with a trained actor flag. When a suspect is trained in tactics and has access to weapons, the presumption of imminent danger should be higher and the timeline shorter. That doesn't mean reckless action. It means earlier, firmer steps to reduce the suspect's ability to script the outcome. Name misuse of training at sentencing. When specialized skills are turned inward, staging a scene, breaching a door, manipulating first responders, courts should recognize the abuse of position formally. The law already does this in other contexts. Domestic cases involving trained professionals should not be exceptions. Ethical questions for you. When a uniform has purchased a bit of grace in a community, how do we decide when to withdraw that credit? If specialized training helps stage a scene or manipulate first responders, should that be an explicit aggravating factor at sentencing? Should AMBER alerts and high-risk domestic protocols carry a trained actor flag, current or former law enforcement, military or corrections, that automatically changes urgency and tactics? What would you want the first 5 steps to be if someone you loved called and said, "I'm afraid of my spouse," and they're a cop? Could you trust those steps to happen every time without hesitation? Kentucky has confirmed that none of these scenes are accurate. Names you've heard tonight are not headlines, they are losses that insist on action. Amanda Peralt, 2 daughters who never should have been in that car, Amy Fanyon, and a woman whose front door should have been the end of a story, not the beginning of one. They are the reason to build systems that are faster and braver than familiarity, more loyal to evidence than to uniforms, and more committed to prevention than postmortems. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, confidential help is available 24/7 in the U.S. The most dangerous step can be the bravest and the one where the system should be at your side. If this deep dive helped you see the contours, the way control becomes a weapon, and the ways evidence can take that weapon away, subscribe for more.